The rain had started just before sunset, turning the streets into shimmering ribbons of light beneath the street lamps. I had stayed late at work, and all I wanted was to get home, make a cup of coffee, and forget about another exhausting day. The sidewalks were almost empty, with most people hurrying to escape the weather. The cold wind pushed against my jacket as I walked through the small park that served as a shortcut to my apartment. It was a route I had taken hundreds of times before, and I expected nothing more than another quiet walk through the rain. Halfway across the park, something caught my attention. A woman sat alone on an old wooden bench beneath a large oak tree. She wasn't holding an umbrella, even though the rain had soaked her coat and dark strands of hair clung to her face. Her hands were tightly wrapped around herself, as though she was trying to hold together the pieces of a life that had fallen apart. Most people would have assumed she was simply waiting for someone, but there was something in the way she stared at the ground that made me slow my steps. I told myself it wasn't my business. I had learned long ago that strangers often carried burdens you couldn't fix. Besides, approaching someone alone at night could easily be misunderstood. I took a few more steps, convincing myself to keep walking. Then I heard her voice. "I don't want to be alone tonight." The words were barely louder than the rain, but they stopped me completely. I turned around. She wasn't looking directly at me. Her eyes remained fixed on the wet pavement, as though she had spoken to the darkness instead of to a stranger. There was no anger in her voice, no desperation meant to attract sympathy. It sounded like the quiet confession of someone who had reached the end of her strength. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, I walked back toward the bench and stopped a respectful distance away. "Are you okay?" I asked gently. She gave a weak smile that disappeared almost immediately. "I don't even know how to answer that anymore." The honesty in her reply caught me off guard. I glanced around the nearly empty park. The rain continued falling steadily, and the last few people hurried toward the parking lot without noticing either of us. She looked exhausted, as if she hadn't slept in days. Dark circles framed her eyes, and her hands trembled slightly from the cold. "You shouldn't stay out here in this weather," I said. "I know. But you're not leaving." She slowly shook her head. "I don't really have anywhere to go." Those words settled heavily between us. I wasn't sure what to do next. Every warning I had ever heard about trusting strangers echoed in my mind. At the same time, everything about her suggested she needed compassion more than anything else. I knew I couldn't solve her problems, but walking away suddenly felt impossible. "My name is Daniel," I said after a moment. She looked up for the first time. "I'm Emily. It's nice to meet you, Emily." She nodded politely, though her expression remained distant. "I haven't felt anything close to nice in a long time," she admitted. I sat down at the opposite end of the bench, careful to give her enough space so she wouldn't feel uncomfortable. "You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to," I said. "But if you need someone to listen, I'm here." For a while, we simply listened to the rain. Finally, she took a slow breath. "Have you ever had one of those weeks where everything you spent years building disappears?" I thought about the question before answering. "Not everything," I replied, "but enough to know how it feels when life changes overnight." She looked at me with quiet surprise. "I thought you were going to tell me everything would be okay." "I don't know if I can promise that." She let out a small laugh, the first genuine sound that wasn't filled with sadness. "Thank you," she whispered. "People always say things they don't really know. I'd rather be honest." Another silence followed, but this one felt different. It wasn't awkward. It was the kind of silence shared by two strangers who were slowly deciding whether trust was possible. Emily reached into her pocket and pulled out a phone with a cracked screen. She stared at it for a moment before locking it again. I've been sitting here for almost 3 hours, she said quietly, waiting for someone. She shook her head. Waiting for myself to figure out what to do next. The answer broke my heart more than I expected. I realized she wasn't asking me to rescue her. She wasn't asking for money or favors. She simply didn't want to face the longest night of her life completely alone. The rain grew heavier, and the temperature continued to drop. I stood and removed my umbrella from my backpack. There's a small cafe a few blocks away that's still open, I said. It's warm, they make good coffee, and it's a public place. If you're comfortable with it, we could go there for a while. No pressure. If you'd rather stay here, I'll respect that. She looked at me for several long seconds, carefully judging whether I could be trusted. Finally, she nodded. I'd like that. As we began walking through the rain together, neither of us realized that this simple decision, a stranger choosing kindness and another choosing to trust again, would become the first chapter of a story that would change both of our lives forever. The warmth of the cafe felt almost unreal after the cold rain outside. Emily wrapped both hands around a steaming cup of tea, but she barely drank it. She seemed more interested in the comfort of holding something warm than in the drink itself. For several minutes, we sat in silence, watching the rain slide down the large front windows. I didn't pressure her to talk. Whatever had brought her here was clearly too heavy to explain in a single conversation. Eventually, she looked up at me. You probably think I'm strange, she said quietly. I think you're someone who's been through a lot. Her eyes filled with tears, but this time she didn't try to hide them. I used to have a normal life, she began. A good job, friends, and someone I thought loved me. I believe we were building a future together. She paused, staring into her cup. But I was wrong. Over the next hour, Emily slowly shared pieces of her story. She had spent nearly 4 years in a relationship with a man who seemed kind and caring at first. Gradually, though, he became controlling. He wanted to know where she was every hour of the day, discouraged her from seeing friends, and constantly criticized her until she began doubting herself. By the time she realized how unhealthy the relationship had become, she felt trapped. I kept telling myself things would get better, she whispered. I thought if I tried harder, he'd change. But he didn't, I said gently. She shook her head. No, it only got worse. One morning, she found the courage to leave. She packed a small suitcase. The following weeks were filled with uncertainty, but they were no longer filled with hopelessness. After reporting everything to the authorities, Emily worked closely with the support organization that had helped her from the beginning. They guided her through every step of the legal process, explained her rights, and helped her create a safety plan. It wasn't easy. Every phone call, every document, and every meeting forced her to relive memories she wanted to forget. Still, she refused to give up. I've spent too much of my life being afraid, she told me one afternoon as we sat in the same cafe where we had first shared a conversation. I don't want fear to make my decisions anymore. I smiled. That's the strongest thing I've ever heard you say. She looked out the window, watching people pass by on the busy sidewalk. A few months ago, I couldn't even imagine tomorrow. Now I'm thinking about next year. Those words reminded me how much she had changed. The woman I had met on that rainy night barely spoke above a whisper. The person sitting across from me now carried herself with quiet confidence. The sadness hadn't disappeared completely, but it no longer controlled her. Several weeks later, Emily received wonderful news. She had been offered a full-time position at a publishing company that appreciated her experience and creativity. When she called to tell me, I could hear the excitement in her voice before she even said the words. I got the job! Congratulations! I laughed. I knew they would see what everyone else was starting to see. What do you mean? How capable you really are. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Thank you, she said softly. For what? For believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself. I didn't know how to respond. I had never thought of myself as anyone's hero. I had simply stopped to listen on a rainy evening. Yet somehow, that simple decision had become part of her journey back to herself. Months passed, and life slowly settled into a peaceful rhythm. Emily moved into a bright little apartment with large windows overlooking a quiet neighborhood park. She decorated it with books, plants, and photographs from new adventures she had begun taking with friends. The apartment wasn't luxurious, but it was hers. It represented freedom, safety, and a fresh beginning. One Saturday morning, she invited me over for coffee. I have something to show you, she said. As I entered, I noticed a framed picture hanging near the front door. It wasn't an expensive painting or a family photograph. It was a simple picture of a park bench on a rainy evening. I looked at her, confused. You went back there? She nodded. I needed to. Why? Because I wanted to remember the place where my life started over. Her answer stayed with me long after she finished speaking. Later that afternoon, we walked through the same park together. The weather couldn't have been more different from the night we first met. The sun shone through the trees, children laughed in the distance, and birds filled the air with cheerful songs. We stopped beside the old wooden bench. Emily smiled. I almost didn't speak that night. I almost didn't stop. She laughed. Can you imagine? I don't think either of us wants to. She sat down on the bench for a moment before standing again. I used to think one bad chapter meant the entire story was over, she said. Now I know it was only the beginning of a new one. As we continued walking, my phone buzzed with a message. It was from Emily a few steps ahead of me. Curious, I opened it. It contained only one sentence. Thank you for hearing me when no one else did. I slipped the phone back into my pocket without replying. Some messages didn't need an answer because life itself had already provided one. Looking back, I often thought about that rainy evening. If I had ignored the quiet voice behind me, our paths would have separated forever. Instead, one small moment of kindness created a future neither of us could have imagined. People often believe that changing someone's life requires grand gestures or extraordinary sacrifices. My experience taught me something different. Sometimes it begins with listening. Sometimes it begins with staying when it's easier to walk away. And sometimes, the most important decision you'll ever make is turning around when a stranger softly whispers, I don't want to be alone tonight. That night didn't just change Emily's future. It changed mine as well, reminding me that hope often arrives in the most unexpected places, and that even the smallest act of compassion can become the beginning of someone's second chance.